private sector is doing their own thing, and the governments have other responsibilities. They need each other. That partnership needs to be established first of all. Bringing back that trust is critical. So this is where the Organization of American States has focused on over the past couple of years to see the private sector as a key player on the issue of social and economic development, job creation, creating regular income, and thereby building revenues for government. Now, in terms of the public-private partnership, there are two ways of looking at it. One is the general policy part. The private sector needs to engage with government, government needs to engage with private sector on policy issues. That's also a partnership, and that can go into wide-ranging issues, penetrating markets, identifying markets, how to improve the level of productivity, to improve the education system in terms of ICT, science and technology, all that will benefit competitiveness of our economies. That is one layer of discussion that needs to take place. It must be a continuous, regular, meaningful, structured debate, not on an ad hoc basis, but continuous. So these two players, forces in society, must be working together, governments and the private sector. The second part is the more commercial part of the public-private partnership. And not many countries have adopted in the Caribbean, at least this approach as yet. We have seen large privatization projects going on. Recently, Jamaica has announced its intention to privatize the airport. The bids are done, the pre-qualification took place. We have seen, and I'm very happy about it, that not only international investors are interested in that privatization, which is one of the largest ones in this region, but also local conglomerates in Jamaica. And that's a great thing. But it has not been established as a norm in terms of large projects, and especially in the infrastructure sector. Latin America has done a lot more in that sense, and there is one country which has even made public-private partnership, PPPs, as a modus to bring governments and private sector together in their constitution. The government of Nicaragua has PPPs as an objective in their constitution. That's how far they went. Paraguay has legislation. So I think one of the first things in the Caribbean that needs to be done in terms of public-private partnership from the commercial point of view is to establish legal frameworks to make it happen and the conditions under which it has to happen. And that is a task that has to be done, has to be carried out in collaboration with the private sector. Again, the debate must focus on building trust between the private sector of the region. And I'm not speaking about only the larger players. I'm speaking also about the small and medium-sized enterprises. The trust needs to be built. The second thing is the policy framework that needs to be established, and we can talk long about what kind of policy framework, but I can see an opportunity for those companies who are willing to penetrate markets beyond the Caribbean to be incentivized with specific measures. And the third thing is the commercial part of fostering public-private partnership. Governments cannot do it alone. They need the private sector, and the private sector needs the government to be able to continue building and creating jobs.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. One of the main objectives of this conference, and by mandate of Minister Dukaran, is actions. Yes, talk, but then actions. And two very specific actions was actually suggested by His Excellency Ramden. One, to basically build a legal and a policy framework for PPP development. So we will actually have that in our action log. And the other, to build trust and to include SMEs in basically the PPP strategy of countries. Will that be capturing your suggestion, sir? Any other action that we should actually put in the action log?
Let me be more specific.
Yes.
The larger conglomerates, and you can count them on your two hands, are critically important in terms of the overall development of the private sector in the region. But the majority of the jobs are created by SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. You need to involve them in the overall economy. One way of doing so is because SMEs may not be able to compete at the regional level or at the global level, but you need to involve them in regional, what I call regional supply or value chains, where they can contribute with their own specific knowledge and expertise in those regional value chains. They may not be part of a global value chain, but there is enough opportunity in the Americas, in this own region, in Central America, in Brazil, for being part of that. But you need policy on that aspect.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, in this same regard, Dr. Rupra, from the bank's perspective, the IDB perspective, you see all the region, you see the differences across countries and across regions in terms of the dynamics of the private sector. So, do you think that there is some sort of a Caribbean sclerosis in terms of private sector in Trinidad and Tobago in the region? Is it dynamic enough? Is it risk-prone enough? What is your assessment on the private sector, sir?
Make a presentation? Right. I'll make it from there.
Sure, you can.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to chat about the problem of economic growth, problem of low economic growth in the Caribbean. I'm going to make 3 very simple points on what is rather than what should be. The first, I hope to dispel the idea that although small economies do face challenges over and above those of larger economies, size is not a binding constraint on economic growth. The second point I want to make, and I do this by illustrating the problems of the Caribbean with respect to other small economies in the world, which I will dub as rows, that there's a Caribbean-specific problem of low economic growth that has nothing to do with economic size. And the third point I would like to make is the Caribbean private sector is a root problem of the low economic growth. I think everybody would agree that a dynamic, innovative, exporting private sector is what a country needs. And I hope to show you the opposite holds. The points are drawn from a report by the IDB called Is There a Caribbean Sclerosis?, which was sparked by a book written by Minister Ducoran a few years ago, where the idea that there may be a political alliance against economic growth was advanced. So, first point. How do I change the presentation? Okay. If size is a binding constraint of economic growth, we expect the mean level of growth to be lower and the dispersion around that mean to be very tightly around the mean. We have the opposite in this graph, which compares small economies and the rest of the world roll. Mean level of growth is slightly lower, but the dispersion around that mean is very high. That implies that size is not a constraint on economic growth. So let's move to the next slide. And this is a very depressing picture. It asks the question, how well is the Caribbean doing with respect to other small economies? It estimates the cumulative loss of GDP per capita in the Caribbean, differentiating between tourism countries and commodity countries, and using as their base rows tourism countries and rows commodity countries, and shows this enormous, steady decline in the Caribbean getting poorer with respect to their comparators, which are other small economies. In fact, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, the gross domestic product per capita of the Caribbean was 4 times higher than other small economies. In 2013, it was 0.9. Next slide. Why? The root cause is lower and falling total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is what economists can't explain. So it's after you take into consideration inputs like labor and capital, what's left. This is where innovation, processes, commodities play a role. It's the first hint that there's something wrong with the private sector in the Caribbean. Next slide. And this is the worst of that. It's an incomprehensible chart, but what it basically shows is that productivity, measured by sales to employment growth, is less than 20% of the similar firms in rows. That is, the private sector is much, much worse than its counterpart in other small economies. Next slide. Next slide. Click. That is the characteristic of firms in the Caribbean relative to rows. They're small, old, locally owned, and do not engage in foreign trade. The worst combination of characteristics a private sector could have. Next. So what do they complain about, the businesses? There you have in red. Well, they complain about things like crime, taxes, lack of educated labor force, etc. One interesting figure is Caribbean firms spend more on security against crime than they do on research and development. So what do the businessmen think is the government pro-business? This chart is remarkable because it says in every single dimension, when businessmen are asked about their governments, they respond more negatively than their counterparts in small economies, except the judicial system. So trust, which was mentioned previously, has an enormous gap with respect to rose countries. But the same is diversion of funds, inappropriate favoritism, etc., etc., etc. These are characteristics of an economic system based on unproductive rent-seeking. I think the phrase is, it's good for some businessmen, but not necessarily good for business. Next slide. Next slide. So, do they operate in a competitive environment? They said no. The anti-monopoly policies are ineffective. Too much money is spent on agriculture, things like that. So, again, those two previous slides suggest when you ask businessmen in surveys, their responses are describing a system in which is based on unproductive rent-seeking, where the state has been captured by the few to the detriment of the many. Next slide. Next slide. So, what was this expression? You know, a crisis is too good an opportunity to waste. In the period following the global economic crisis, very little has been done by Caribbean countries, which are on the left-hand side, compared to other countries' small economies. Look at the dramatic changes in terms of pro-business